to yet another episode of Out of Bund. My name is Faith.
My name is Jennifer.
And we are Out of Bund. In today's episode, we are joined by Cameron Hoelscher, who will introduce himself in a minute. Cameron, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am a forensic analyst at the moment. I also do a bit of incident response work, and it is mostly internal facing, not client facing. So how did I get into InfoSec? I went to college and found out, oh, you can study InfoSec as a degree in the United States, and my university happened to offer that program. So I did that. 3 of the 4 years of university was at a help desk, which, I mean, all of us on this podcast know it's a really formational, fundamental experience.
Yeah.
There's a lot of pain, but there's a saying, you never know what's going to walk through that door, and it really prepares you for that and gets that mindset, and always that customer service. Did a DFIR internship after college, did 2 years of IT work, and then after that work in third-party security and compliance. Moved from the East Coast down to Texas and did 2 years of work at another employer doing SOC and DFIR work. And now I do DFIR work and Forensic Analyst work.
Ooh.
Very interesting.
In short, Cameron is a geek, and we're really happy to have you.
Yay. So yeah, based on Cameron's introduction, you can probably already guess the topic that we're going to discuss today: digital forensics. We already slightly touched upon it in a previous podcast, the one with Aben Lau, where we discussed incident response, and we received quite some positive feedback on it, but also a lot of questions on what is actually the difference between incident response and digital forensics, and what is actually digital forensics. So we kind of decided to make an extra episode on this, and we're very happy that Cameron wants to help us with that. Let's start with a basic question, Cameron. What is, in your opinion, actually digital forensics or forensics analysis?
Okay, so I am going to lean on, there's a institution in the United States called NIST, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they have a very stodgy sort of definition. In the strictest connotation, the application of computer science and investigative procedures involving the examination of digital evidence following proper search authority, yada, yada, yada. What that doesn't get at is that the best way to think about it is that, let's say you're trying to figure out what a computer is doing. You could be, if you're doing IR or doing SOC work, you're looking at information that might be streaming from EDR or host-based IDS or things like that. And all of that data is sort of metadata. It's like the computer keeping a diary, or the network keeping a diary about things. It says, on this day, I went to this website and this is what happened. Digital forensics, on the other hand, is looking at raw things that have to do with the computer. That might be the disk image, the exact series of zeros and ones. It might be looking at a acquisition of the memory, again, that exact series of zeros and ones. And it might even be network packet captures if you're really lucky, although that is considerably less common. To make a comparison to the kind of evidence you would bring in court, although I haven't done that, Eben clearly has. Documentary evidence is what you would think of as logs going to your SIMs. It's like a diary of what a person was doing. It's legal contracts, things like that. But real evidence, forensic evidence, because it's that exact series of zeros and ones, it's closer to fingerprints and blood samples, DNA samples, things like that. And there's ways that you look at that and determine whatever your truth is, or whatever it is that you're looking for in your investigation.
Yeah.
So basically, if I can just summarize, incident response would be looking at way more data than forensics analysis, right? Forensics analysis, you're basically diving into one particular device or host, so just a few systems as compared to incident response.
Yeah. And sometimes the definition of forensics can be more narrow, it can be more broad. For instance, there's the open source project Velociraptor. And you can say to Velociraptor, hey, go fetch this one file from disk and bring it back to me. And that is like the most common term for that is host-based forensic analysis. You're not getting the entire disk. You're not getting like all the blank space on that disk or anything, but you are getting a file that you can then process using whatever tools you want and get more information than you might through like typical system logs or whatever agents are sitting on the system.
When you get a case, right, do you work on the case the same way every single time? Because maybe one of the cases that you'll get will eventually need to go to court. Is there a distinction that you make when working cases, and when do you know that this is a big case or this is a small case?
Gosh, it's a bit of a spidey sense, like knowing if something is big or not. A whole lot of it depends on what the threat is or what the bad thing is that's happened. In the US, in terms of regulation, if there is a case that involves payment card information or it involves protected health information, that's a big deal. That's a problem. If it turns out that something bad has happened with any of that kind of data, you need to think about notifying people. You need to think about possibly paying fines, scary things like that. Depending on, so sometimes the work that I do right now involves like working for a customer and understanding, okay, what happened on these computers, and if so, is there something that my employer needs to do in order to like make it up to them, provide more information, provide notification to them, things like that. Anyone who works in client-facing work knows that certain clients are higher temperature or have greater demands on your time or the amount of details you provide them than others. That's certainly something. And the novelty of threats, for threats like the print nightmare vulnerability, threats like the SolarWind vulnerability, threats like the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability, those were very much high temperature to work on because of the novelty of the threat and the severity of it.
I mean, is that also how you, for example, determine where to start actually with looking for things or with investigating stuff? Because I've been involved in a couple of incidents, mostly from incident management perspective then. And the biggest part that you're always, or the biggest question that I always have, or my client always has, is like, we have this idea of something that happened, but we don't have any of the details yet. We just know something happened. Where do we start? How do we start looking into things?
That'll depend on whether you have information that is like outside of the computer and that was flowing to a SIM or flowing to backup somewhere. Like that information that tells you like this happened on this date and like here are the details of that. That's the best way you can triage and understand if it's worth it to go and get an entire disk image, transfer it at a snail's pace across the internet and do all of that stuff. But if not, to name one of the tools that I sometimes use, there is a commercial tool called Cape that can gather what's called a triage image from a Windows host. And there are some other projects like UAC, Unix Artifact Collector, that can do the same thing on a Unix-like host. And the point of those is to get a collection of interesting forensic artifacts that gives you an idea of like the crucial aspects of what happened. You're not transferring 500 gigabytes, you're transferring maybe 20 of those, but they have really important things in there. There's Windows event logs, there's system hives, there's things like maybe the contents of a user's download folder, things like that. So ideally you would want to look at whoever the person's SIM is and look at the logs there, because that's the most obvious evidence. You don't have to process it. It tells you what happened. The secondary is the triage image. We're gathering just a few artifacts. And then if you can't do that, which is edge cases, then you start getting forensic images and less often memory images, and just going through and like processing that evidence sort of to like a minimal extent to answer the question of, is it worth looking at this further?
Yeah.
It definitely is an art and not a science at all.
Yeah, because to summarize, I mean, there are situations where, for example, a client doesn't have a SIEM or some kind of log collecting and analyzing mechanism in place. Then it would be interesting to look at maybe like the standard items that you would look at. So, for example, Windows events or downloads within a user's file or whatever. But if that's not the case, then you would immediately need to go like for the entire disk image, for example, or to go really look through everything basically.
Yeah.
And if we go back to forensic analysis, there are different types of forensics analysis, right? So there's memory analysis, network analysis, what you mentioned before. Is there one that you prefer doing more than the other?
And why?
I would say that out of all the forensic analysis that I could do, analyzing disk evidence is the most interesting, and analyzing Windows disk evidence is almost the most rewarding. Because Windows has been built up over years and years and years, there's lots of little compatibility features and shims and things that have been kept around since like the early 90s that ensures that legacy software keeps working. And it's because of all those little nooks and crannies that you're able to get interesting forensic information from Windows in places that you might not expect. So the puzzle of looking in those unexpected places is almost kind of fun. And you can take a Windows system and get the most evidence out of it usually. I would say a second place is images of Mac OS computers, and then distant third is Linux. Linux does not have compatibility shims and little proprietary files that you have to apply special parsers to. It's open source, so you know exactly what you're getting.
Okay, so with regards to the challenges that you encounter when doing forensic analysis, are there some that stand out for you?
Oh yeah. So people who work in a SOC or IR role, or who know things about network security, the frustration is that network traffic is becoming increasingly encrypted, end-to-end encrypted, meaning that you can't intercept it and get interesting information out of it. The same thing is happening with disk images. For example, on Windows laptops, it's extremely common nowadays, and it's almost required in some places, for a Windows disk to be completely encrypted with BitLocker. For a MacBook, it's going to be completely encrypted with FileVault. And the open source tools that keep up with those standards and that encrypt those things, sometimes they just fall apart and don't work. So you have to like get commercial tools to do what you need to do. And it just takes time to decrypt. No matter how good your hardware is, you're limited by the write speed of the hard drives that you're working with, and it can be a pain to sit there and not even be able to look at the disk image without waiting for it to decrypt for hours and hours and hours. And that's just one piece of it. And I recall a question earlier about how sort of differentiating between different forensics cases. Cases are really different depending on the threat, depending on the client, depending on what the systems are that I'm looking at. And because things are so different and there's so much depth in a memory image and so many different answers that you can get out of it, it's hard to apply automation to that. For SOC tickets, like there are things like SOAR and really like in-depth ticketing systems that'll tell you things like, okay, I was able to look up these IOCs for you. I was able to resolve this identity to this account. I was able to look up this workstation, see who owns it. applying that sort of automation to forensics is just much more difficult.
Mhm.
There have been efforts by certain standards bodies to say, okay, you know that on a Windows system, you should see these files.
Mhm.
This should be their list of hashes. And then you feed that to your forensics tool and it just kind of whitelists them as normal.
Yeah.
Those things, because operating systems change so much nowadays, they haven't necessarily caught up with the rapid pace of system updates. I mean, I've never used a hash list because I don't know where to get one that's up to date for the latest versions of Windows Server, the latest versions of
Mhm.
Windows 10, the latest versions of Mac OS. And it would be nice to have that, to have those things and have that level of automation. But I don't, with how deep forensic analysis can be and how different the tasks are in each case.
But doesn't it also get a bit more complicated when, for example, a threat adversary actually utilizes legit processes or legit files or any type of activity on a system?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
There was, for example, a great deal of difficulty identifying systems where the print nightmare vulnerability
Mhm.
might have been exploited, because you can't just look at any time that the print spooler process was used. I mean,
No.
people got to print stuff. But you scratch your head and you wonder, okay, can I look at the process command line and squint my eyes and understand if it might have been exploited? Do I have to look at like which registry keys were touched recently? Like
Mhm.
how do I do this and how do I distinguish normal from not normal?
Yeah.
Yeah. I can imagine that that complicates things a lot.
Yeah, it does for sure.
Yeah.
So, Cameron, what is your day like? As in, it sounds it sounds rather difficult and challenging. Tell us.
But
How do you
exciting also
start?
at the same time.
Exactly. So how do you start? What does it look like?
Mhm. Uh, it always depends on the caseload. Um, Something that I thought about when I was prepping for this episode is that
Mhm.
people think that digital forensics is really cool. I mean, yeah, no, it's crazy. You're like, a computer can do that?
Mhm.
Why does it do that? Like, how did you find out that obscure and crazy answer? But to me, I would equate my role to what the National Transportation Safety Board does in the US. They come in for major wrecks of transportation of some kind. Like a train goes off the rail in the Washington, D.C. metro, and they call in the NTSB and they make sure that it never happens again.
Mhm.
They contact the NTSB when Teslas are routinely catching on fire, things like that.
Yeah.
And the NTSB is very thorough, but it takes a long time. It takes a lot of very special expertise.
Mhm.
And I think that in an ideal world, you wouldn't want someone to have to do that level of analysis to figure out, okay, what happened on this computer?
Yeah.
You want to push it to the left and say, okay, I can tell from the logs you were sending to your SIM that this happened. I could tell from the EDR console that this happened, things like that.
Mhm. With regards to the challenges that you were talking about, it sounds that you really just need it's more about experience. It's more about knowing your system. It's no more about just keeping up with what's happening. So how do
Mhm.
you do it?
Oh gosh.
Tough questions,
So
Dave.
yeah, no, I talked about my background earlier,
Mhm.
and something I've been mulling over for a while is that there is no such thing as the classically trained information security practitioner. You can be a
Mhm.
classically trained Shakespearean actor or ballerina dancer, things like that. Those have been around for a long time. Everyone knows like what it means to be classically trained, but InfoSec, not so much.
Everyone has a different background, basically.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There are cases like one recently where I went into a MacBook, not knowing where to find the answers that I needed to find. So it was simply looking at my commercial tool suite and saying, okay, give me everything, and I will go through it with a tiny little teaspoon and like do searches across stuff for keywords and try to sort of pin the dots together on a big corkboard and understand like, where could this evidence be? There's lots of times that I don't know what I'm doing and I feel it out. It's like it's not possible to stay up to date with every threat for Mac OS, every threat for Windows. There's so many nooks and crannies in Windows that, I mean, there's so many ways that you can make a Windows system do something that it shouldn't. So how can you possibly know Windows as well as the people who are like who have created it, who have coded and maintained it over the years? It isn't possible. Relying on people on your team to help you out, like, hey, have you worked on this kind of system before? Like, do you know how to take an image of an F5 and figure out what's going on with that? Relying on external blogs from security researchers, that's really key. And doing what you can to give back and say, I had this incident. Here's not just the IOCs I saw, like the MD5s and the domains, but how this process behaved and how it stuck out from being not normal.
But that latter part, I find that very interesting because up until recently, at least in my experience, organizations found it very difficult to share insights on incidents that they had in the past. So they wouldn't share IOCs, they wouldn't share lessons learned, not even just within the industry of some sorts, not even publicly, not even like at a round table, just with a couple of select peers. How do you deal with that? Because I can imagine that, especially in your function, in your role, it is very important to share that kind of information with up and coming digital forensics experts, potentially within your own organization, but maybe also if you're, I don't know, mentoring others outside. How do you do that?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that really is a hard problem to wrap your head around. It seems at the moment, like just to me as a person who looks at this information, that it's security vendors who share this information the most often. Security vendors who have access to just like a huge lake of client data, and they can anonymize it and distance it from the client enough so that they can get something out of it. Yeah, like the notion of like an organization admitting like we had this bad thing happen and like here's how we'll prevent it in the future, like that, at least in the United States, like that introduces like questions of liability. It introduces questions of like who is going to like turn up on your doorstep and try to sue you for that information. Right now the US federal government and, for example, the US CERT, the US Computer Emergency Response Team, like they're very valuable for the intel that they share. And the reason that they're able to share that information is because they don't name the clients or name the company. They might name the industry vertical, but that's about it. And there really isn't a lot of information that I share externally about my so-called war stories or my incidents, because I don't know how to anonymize that information when it's clear who I work for on LinkedIn, and like abstract those lessons. I'm not an independent security researcher, and if I were, like I would think that I would go through the same safe and responsible disclosure type things. How can you navigate a responsible disclosure process for an incident? I really don't think you can at the moment. At least there isn't an agreed upon process for that.
It's a shame, actually, because I feel that most of the cybersecurity specialists within the industry are very passionate about what they do, and they really want to, for lack of a better term, improve the world, basically.
Of course.
But this kind of stigma actually does kind of limit the development of it.
Yeah. So just piggybacking on your comment, Cameron, do you have any shareable war stories? Shareable, not not something linking to your organization or previous employers, just something that is open.
I can share something. Let's see. I actually wrote about it recently. So at an employer, there was an EDR and it had a built-in rule that said, hey, the IIS, which is the web server for Windows Server, IIS spawned a command prompt, which then spawned other things. In fact, it said, hey, who am I? And it did that over and over and over again. So that happened a month prior to me being brought into the incident. And the tricky part of that was that because of the communication between the team that was working on the alert and the team that owned the system ended up saying, yeah, that's normal system behavior. It was kind of a game of telephone between them. And I don't know how they got to that answer. There might have also been like issues with people speaking English as a second language, or
Yes.
yeah, no, I don't even like, hopefully that doesn't happen again, but my goodness. So I'm brought in a month later. The same attacker is still on the system. They're still exploiting something on there in order to get IIS to pop them command prompts and do their bidding. So we take a forensic image of the system and we look at it and we squint our eyes and we see, oh, there is a scheduled task on Windows and it is launching this thing that looks like it's associated with .NET framework for programming or business apps of some kind. And I mean, the file name checks out and the file location checks out, and it calls itself something to do with .NET. No, that is not .NET. That's PHP engine. This thing has been running a PHP backdoor for the past year. Very fun. Yeah, the past year.
Wow.
And it was only recently with the introduction of EDR and behavior-based rules that this was able to be caught. So yay EDR, but oh man, I wish I could go back a year in time.
You don't want to think of what they were actually able to do in that time period.
Yeah, the system logs start kind of falling off after even a month on a system. My
Sometimes
goodness.
7 days already.
And,
oh yeah.
And here you have like a year worth of data. So when you did the forensic image, did you do just for 1 month or did you do for whole year? How?
Like drag the timeline back as far as it'll go.
As it could?
Yeah.
Oh, the work.
I mean, no, not really the work, because the system logs fall off so quickly.
Yeah, they're overwritten.
Yeah, they're overwritten. They just roll like a buffer. So I mean, Windows security logs, I feel like the most they will ever stick around, like the security log saying like this person logged on, they did this like privilege action, things like that. That sticks around for like a month at most. That's not going to extend back a year. Like there are hard limits on that. But the interesting and frustrating thing about this case was that this PHP engine and the thing it was running were like 10 years old. This attacker was just hadn't updated whatever their attack was in the past 10 years. The troubling part was that the web shell, like the PHP code that gets interpreted by PHP engine, it was written onto this in this horrible obfuscated format. Zend, the company that makes PHP, historically has used a formatting or obfuscation algorithm called ZenGuard. And so without having the tooling that dates back 10 years in time, like you could still download it from Zen's website, or kind of, without that tooling to deobfuscate it in real time and then spit out the results. Like you couldn't understand what the web shell was doing and what kind of impact it had on the system. So the real teeth pulling operation and the hardest technical part of it was finding a Docker image that was old enough to be willing to run that old version of PHP. And then finding like some ancient GitHub project that was willing to sort of live disassemble that PHP code and tell me what was running. I mean, I squeezed the juice out of that orange eventually, but my goodness, it's so rude of the attacker to use such an old version of PHP.
Can I ask, how long did that take
How
you?
long exactly? That was my question.
Oh man. I mean, you take your teaspoon and you lift up Mount Fuji some days. Like you put your head to the grindstone, you just do it. Like it was less than a week for sure, but I don't quite remember how long it took. That case was was like messy outside of those elements for sure.
Yeah.
And do you normally get an ask from top management with regards to attribution? Like, who is it?
I actually have a second question on that. So go on, and then I have a second question on that.
Like as a security practitioner, I think that attribution is really difficult. And I mean, well, the thing is, so for example, I sometimes work on DLP cases. So let's say someone downloads something from your content management system online. How do you attribute who did that? You can see the IP address they downloaded it from. You can see that they logged in as this certain user, but it doesn't tell you what computer they did it with. You don't know if that computer was corporate managed or not. Like you don't even know their user agent string, because web apps don't want to tell you that. So you don't know what browser they were using, basic things like that. And then you take that level of thinking like, okay, modern web apps and like very expensive corporate software will log this about a person who is doing stuff. How much information can you really squeeze out about attributing malware or attributing attacks to a certain person when you have an IP address, you might have a user agent string, and you might have the raw code of what they're doing.
Yeah.
And the like incident coordinators and the sort of legal context that I work with in general management, I think that they have that same level of understanding about how uncertainty, like the level of uncertainty around attribution. And you also ask yourself, like, is it, if we attribute something like and give that a certain level of confidence, what are we going to get out of it? How is that? How are we going to use that information as actionable intelligence to improve our instant response and improve the resilience of our systems?
Yeah. And I think there's one thing that I learned from the CTI course is to ask yourself, if let's say it was The Simpsons, would it change anything? Would your actions or behaviors or mitigations or countermeasures that you apply, will they change in any way? If the answer is no, then you're just wasting your time, right?
It kind of depends, right? It really kind of depends also on the type of organization that you have, on the type of confidentiality of the files that you're protecting, for example. It really depends.
Yeah, I think it's, if you're working with a client, then definitely they would like to know, hey, are you the ones who are guilty here, or are we the ones who've erred? But thankfully, that is not mostly the case. So
yeah, so that was actually partially related to the question that I wanted to ask, because there are cases where you actually know that in the media it was publicized that there was an attributed attacker, they were taken to court, etc. But I think as cybersecurity specialists, we more often see that that's not the case, that doesn't happen. We more often just identify what has happened, but not who has done it. And I find that that's actually one of the most difficult things to get an understanding for at the client side, at least, because they really just don't try, or they don't try. They just really find it difficult to identify that they don't, that there's a possibility that they can't find out who did it actually.
Man, that sparked something, but I forget what it was. So please continue.
Well, we can continue on a little bit with the next part that I'm curious about, because based on your story, I can kind of get the gist that you need to be curious to be able to work in digital forensics. You need to like puzzling, because I can understand that it's a lot of thinking work and a lot of like, does this work or does that work, or how can I find that little particular part of it? What are things that you would recommend someone to be able to do or to be able to have if they want to start working in digital forensics?
How do we get into it?
Yeah,
that's always the question. How do you get into security?
Well, specifically digital forensics, because that's a whole subpart.
So to first give the broad answer of like, how do I think you get into security? Let's say that you're studying for the CISSP or Security Plus or something like that. These certifications will not teach you the ways in which systems can fail or do things that they're not supposed to do. They won't tell you that an attacker will often use Active Directory to do terrible things to Windows systems. They won't tell you about the history or significance of vulnerabilities from software from various vendors. That's something that you get working on the job or reading the news. And oh man, if you aren't working in a role that gives you an understanding of how those like delicate pieces of the Jenga tower that is technology can fall apart, the next best thing you can do besides like actually working in that role and seeing it happening is semi-anonymous communities. So before I went to college, I spent a lot of time reading forums like Slashdot in high school, and people on there, they're hiding behind whatever username they're hiding behind, and they would let you know that not only was this latest debacle from vendor X like really bad, they would tell you like, oh yeah, it's been like this for years. I've dealt with this on the job. Like it will continue to be bad. Do not trust this vendor. And yeah, that's like vitriol and flaming, and people exaggerate on the internet. But you take that and you file it away, and you understand like, okay, this is the consensus, and this is like what the security community thinks.
Yeah.
Now, more specifically for digital forensics, there are sample disk images out there for Windows systems and Linux systems where it's sort of a mini capture the flag, and you look at it and you say, okay, I have this disk image and I want to process it with these tools, and I've been given a set of questions to answer about this. The trouble with those disk images is that, at least on one of the ones that was provided by some federal agency, they included a disclaimer saying, well, we might get into some kind of trouble for distributing this disk image because it contains very old but still copyrighted Windows software from Microsoft. Like this is a disk image of a Windows 98 system, and because of copyright law, we can't distribute this. You could theoretically boot this thing up and have a functioning Windows system, and like that violates intellectual property.
Yeah.
So the answer is to use virtual machines or use any spare laptop or computer you have, install the operating system you want to look at. Linux is obviously the easiest to access, but you can get temporary Windows licenses now and virtual machines from Microsoft. They're very willing to do that. It's for web development, but you can take it and play with it and use it for forensics if you want. Take those disk images, simulate some kind of bad situation on it. For example, if you wanted to simulate data loss prevention or DLP, download and upload a bunch of stuff to Gmail and Dropbox, and then take that image, process it through open source software, and see what kind of answers you get out of it.
Yeah.
The thing that I'm relied on a lot in terms of expertise for my job is understanding what juice you can squeeze out of the orange, understanding what forensic evidence is out there and that exists. Evidence of someone downloading stuff to a system, very easy to find. Like there are disks that will, like you can find traces of stuff on disk, you can find system logs, things like that. But a certification or without that hands-on experience, you won't know that, oh man, how do I find out that someone uploaded something to Dropbox?
Yeah.
That's basically impossible. Like unless you really get into the weeds or the system has something like really detailed. And by creating your own disk images and like you keep them to yourself, you don't distribute them, you can work with that proprietary operating system. You can work with Windows disk images, Mac OS disk images. They're up to date. You know exactly what happened on them because you're hopefully taking notes as you download and upload things or run simulated ransomware on it. Then there's like all sorts of open source software you can run on it. So you could do live acquisition from that virtual thing. You could do Velociraptor. You could do like memory analysis. Like the choices are kind of endless, but then then the head scratching thing is what situations are interesting and what
Yeah.
do I want to simulate? And
Yeah.
that requires like kind of reading around and understanding like what is the threat landscape? What are security vendors saying? What are like threat feeds and intel feeds saying? And how do I make that look kind of realistic on this simulated system?
Yeah.
So basically knowing what you can actually simulate and performing targeted research is actually. Yeah.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
just to like speed up your analysis, you always have a clean or a good system that like a golden image that you can always compare what looks malicious versus normal. No?
I don't, unfortunately.
Okay.
I had mentioned earlier that in terms of processing a system and getting, for example, the hashes of the system files and the executables, I don't have current hash sets, and I don't have, like for example, samples of Windows event logs from a system that isn't compromised and is just doing system updates or having normal logins and logouts. That's something that unfortunately just had to build up over time in my head with experience. I wish there were samples out there of normal system activity. In the SOC and IR world, one of the sort of golden eggs that people want to chase is this user behavior analysis and this baselining of normal activity. And I mean, it's a more uncommon technology because no matter how much money for R&D is poured into it,
Mhm.
it's going to depend on the environment. And it's going to
Yeah.
depend on a lot of different factors. And you could get very dangerous false positives out of it, of course.
Yeah. And I think user behavior analytics is something that maybe could work okay in like a bank, right? Where everything is the same, but in other places.
Speaking from the SOC corner, because I'm still technically in the SOC corner, guys, it will work in an organization that is mature enough, but that is immediately the pinnacle. You need to know what kind of systems you have. You need to know the behavior of your users, or rather you need to know what kind of policies you have. You need to know what they're allowed and what they're not allowed. And based around that, then you can actually start baselining things. But again, it's very difficult. You need to have a really mature environment for that. And it's something that you want to achieve, but it's not necessarily something that you can immediately get as an organization, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, after all these years, the CIS 20 controls, the lower ones are the ones you want to go for. You want to have your hardware inventory. You want to have your software inventory.
CMDB.
Oh yeah, yeah.
CMDB.
I think even Dani, who came the previous session, she was like, you know what, you just need to concentrate on the 5, right?
Yeah.
First of all, get your CMDB in order, know your vulnerabilities, know what you have, etc., and then look at the rest. Otherwise, it's not
too much to focus on. Too much to focus on.
Yeah. I mean, you got to eat the nutritious part of the meal before you move on to tiramisu. As awesome as tiramisu is, like you can't have your dessert until
I'm
you
hungry.
Well, you can, but just not every day, unfortunately.
Oh man, yeah. I went through a period of eating a little bit too much sugar this summer, and it just did not make me feel good.
No, if you do that too often, it just gets too bad.
Oh yeah.
I'm the weirdo who ate tiramisu before dinner, you know.
Even
you do not believe in delayed gratification, I guess. My goodness.
Exactly. With regards to how do we get into the field, most of the job descriptions for a forensic analyst basically involve commercial tools, right? But we're not yet in the field, so we do not have that money to spend on commercial tools. What's your say on that?
There's plenty of open source things out there that can teach you the ins and outs of forensic analysis. It's not what tool you use, it's what you do with it. Like there are various commercial tools that I could run against a Windows disk image, and they tell me a lot of the same stuff with a different UI, with different output formats at different speeds. But it's like, I think that job descriptions that list those commercial tools are flawed, but I mean, it's almost sort of a shorthand to refer to, like, we want you to have the forensic analysis tools that
Yeah.
like match with the stuff that this commercial security tool can do. And then you get into a trap of, okay, this tool that costs $10,000 per license, like I can't just buy that and use it at home. Yeah, it's a bit difficult to, what you have to do is you have to immerse yourself in those open source projects and understand like how to squeeze as much out of them and do what we consider like industry standard forensics, like on those typical kinds of evidence, on those Windows disk images, those Linux disk images.
Yeah.
How it is that you prove that on your resume, that you have put the work in and done your homework, I don't think I have an answer for that, because we live in a world where it's about keywords, and it's about like various layers of people reviewing your resume. And if they don't see that commercial tool, then you can be stuck.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the difficulty also, right? For most open source projects, you also don't have any type of certifications or online badges that you can show to prove that you actually did the work and that you actually used the tools so that you can learn the capabilities.
Yeah. Like the closest I think you can come is establishing like a blog or making videos, like walking through how you did something.
Being
like,
yourself out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Are there like some, like top 3 or top 5 forensic tools, open source forensic tools that you would recommend? I know you've mentioned like Velociraptor, but are there others?
Let's see. For memory forensics, the standard is volatility. It's now like in a bit of a state of flux between volatility 2 and volatility 3. Like that's really incredible for memory analysis, and it easily does as much as commercial tools do. Plazo, which some people know better as log to timeline, is awesome for processing Windows and Mac and Linux disk images. If you are uncertain about how to process the things that come out of Plazo, then Scadi, which is SKADI, is a project that has gone quiet a bit, but it's still stable. And it's a virtual machine that you can feed evidence. You say like, hey, here's my ISO, and it'll process it with Plazo, and it'll like write that data, and then it'll open it up in tools like ELK, which is an open source sim, and it'll open it up in tools like Google's TimeSketch project and help you navigate that data. And getting all those tools to sing in harmony can be a pain, but because Scotty is it's a tool that's pre-baked, and then you just go and grab the entire VM and everything's already connected together, that can really simplify your process.
Yeah.
Nice. Thank you. So we got tools to get us started.
Yeah, for sure.
And also some tips. I'm looking also a little bit at the time, because while I am absolutely loving this conversation and all the insights that you can share, Cameron, we are at the top of the hour that we scheduled. Is there anything that you would still like to share with the viewers? Any like last words that you want to embark us on with?
Yeah. So what else? This was in the getting into the role advice section I prepared. I did not get here where I am knowing the things I do without making a lot of mistakes. One of the very first experiences I had with Linux, I was using the partitioning wizard, and it said, "Are you sure you want to overwrite this?" And I said, yeah, I know what I'm doing. And I picked the wrong drive and overwrote all of my precious stuff on Windows. And it was like middle school, and I just wept.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I can imagine.
From then on, virtual machines for Linux are my friend. From articles that I've read, like nothing scholarly or anything, anyone who is like feeling uncertain about themselves, or especially marginalized people, they feel pressure to get difficult tasks right the first time. and they also feel ashamed of, or they don't want to ask for help because they feel guilty. So do whatever you need to do to set up an environment where not only can you make plenty of mistakes and not cause lasting damage, and you can roll those mistakes back, especially with the virtual machines, you can work to make yourself comfortable in that environment. Like, give yourself permission to make those mistakes, because it's only if you fail and then get up again that you can improve from there on out.
I think that's something.
Hallelujah.
I think that's something that we often forget, because we just want to be perfect and we immediately want to have things right, but that's not the way that we learn them.
No.
Yeah. To add to that, Cameron, I did an RMRF on a Palo Alto Networks firewall in a client's environment while I was still a noob, and I didn't know Linux. So yeah.
Oh my
gosh.
I did.
I'm so sorry.
The good thing is I'm not shy at asking questions. So I just found the Linux guru, and I'm like, help me. So yeah. Cool. Jennifer, let's wrap.
I think I'm done for now, at least. Cameron, I love the conversation, and you're more than welcome to join next time again, maybe for the same topic, maybe for another one, but
come teach us, we've learned a lot from you today.
For sure. Yeah, and it was definitely fun watching the previous episodes of this, and like, even me as someone in the industry, I definitely learned things.
Awesome. That's what we want to hear.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks for
joining. You're welcome. Thanks for joining. That being said, for the viewers, you know the drill. We love to have suggestions also for topics. So if you have an idea, or if you want to participate in the conversation like Cameron did, feel free to join and let us know.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.